I'm delighted. We're really honored to have Jaron Lanier here. He is one of the wise folks of Silicon Valley, has been involved, most of your minds will be associated with the invention of artificial intelligence, but he has been a thinker across a whole broad range of Silicon Valley issues. He's also a composer and musician, an artist, an author most recently. We're really so glad to have you with us, Jaron.
Well, thanks for having me here. In my view, what happened to musicians and journalists and photographers and various other people who live by their hearts and brains is not exceptional. It's not just a problem for the creative classes or for certain kinds of particular creative people, but rather it's the early warning sign that foretells problems facing middle classes all over the world in general. And I've started to understand it in that light. And so when I talk in the context of the arts about economics and information science, there's really a multi-level understanding that I want to try to convey, both of what the near term will mean to us all in the arts, which is hard, but also in the long term, how if we can survive, we also can help prove a pattern that can help others survive, all sorts of other people, everybody else who isn't fantastically wealthy, basically. I think that the arts have a new job of serving as the pioneers for the survival of the middle classes in general. So that might sound like a crazy claim to start a talk with, but let me explain what I mean to you. And also I'll say parenthetically, while I don't know for sure what your situation is, I'm just going to predict based on communicating with a lot of educational institutions recently that you're thinking about fundraising right about now. And I do have a few thoughts that might or might not be useful. Most of what I'm going to say is sort of bigger picture stuff, but I hope I might be able to offer you a few seeds that might be of some use as you think about that. On the other hand, maybe your finances are golden, and that's the farthest from your concern. And I think, okay, so we'll talk about that too. All right, so I'm going to begin with Aristotle. Aristotle left us a remarkable little quote, which I'm going to paraphrase here. And it is, when the looms can operate themselves and when the lutes can pluck themselves, then all men will be free. Now, this is an absolutely astounding quote. It's astounding on many, many levels. I'm only going to cover a few of them to start with. For one thing, it shows that this idea of technological progress was alive at that early date, which is something we don't often realize. But it makes perfect sense, because the people who had gathered in the relative safety and comfort of city-states at that time knew what the alternative was, and knew that the difference was technique, know-how, skill, memory of what worked and what didn't work. And so mankind had very much already embarked on the ramp of using technology to create the potential for betterment. Another thing that's absolutely remarkable about this is he's framing music as an absolute necessity, and it would be awfully nice if we didn't have to force the slaves to do it. And that's an absolutely astonishing way of thinking about music, and yet that is apparently how it seemed at the time. And of course, today, a huge number of people only wish they could get by doing music. You know, there are more people who wish they had time to play music than can do so, and so it's hard for us to put ourselves in that frame of mind. But then there's this other assumption in it that technology at that time had already improved life, had already created enough wiggle room, enough of an increment of freedom for some. Remember, this is still a slave state we're talking about, but it had created enough wiggle room for at least those who benefited from it to start thinking lofty thoughts. And those lofty thoughts would have not had the time of day to appear were it not for technology. And so there was this natural thought, well, if technology gets good enough, then this thing should just go better and better and better, and then even the slaves will be free. What a remarkable thought. And he was even thinking about the slaves. That's another thing, is we sometimes think of slavery as something that was a moral blindness, but this proves it wasn't. It was more a necessary evil, at least to his mind. What a remarkable quote. So we're now going to zoom ahead to the 19th century. In my view, the 19th century dialogues about the relationship between technology and the well-being of people still govern almost all of our conversations today, and part of our job is still to overcome them. I think they're holding us back. But let me describe some of the major elements of the 19th century conversation. What had happened at that sort of medium state of industrialization, as we think of it now, is that quite a few people had tasted the fruit of improvement from technological advancement. But then the problem with technology is that it's not static. It keeps on changing. So as soon as one has adjusted to a niche made available by some state of technological advancement, very shortly thereafter, technology changes again and one's niche is dissolved. The 19th century is filled with the folklore of exactly this sort of predicament. The Ballad of John Henry is one example, and the story of the Luddites is another. And don't be embarrassed. By the way, if I know you're not a class of students, but if I make a reference to something that you're not familiar with, I want to tell you what I always tell students, which is just tell me. Everybody can't know everything. So does everybody know who the Luddites were and John Henry and all that? Yeah. So just tell me. No? Okay. So let me just go over this. One of the most famous songs of the 19th century is a ballad of John Henry, who's a fantastic railroad worker, and he's competing with a machine that's laying down railroad tracks. And he beats the machine, but only at the cost of dying from exhaustion at the end of the song. And the Luddites, going back to Aristotle's interest in weaving, the Luddites were textile workers in England who were displaced by improving technologies and rioted. And it was a particularly chaotic and violent episode. And it leaves us with the term Luddite, which is used today to refer to somebody who's uncomfortable with technology. But at the time, it was more of a labor movement thing. Now, the two major schools of rhetoric from the 19th century that still guide us today, in my view, were precisely about this question of what the role of people is as technology gets better. One of them is the legacy of Karl Marx, and the other is science fiction. And I'd like to talk a little bit about each of those. Science fiction, early science fiction, and for that matter, all phases of science fiction, including the most recent iterations of science fiction, are about what the identity of humans will be as circumstances change. There are generally two forms of change. One is technological progress, and the other is encountering aliens and space travel and all that sort of thing. But we should remember that at the point of origin, with writers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, the question of technology change was very much at the forefront. And in fact, we can go back further. If we think about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, we should remember that immediately prior to their crazy weekend in the Alps, there had been a slightly lunatic MD who was attempting to reanimate the dead as a public exhibition by running electricity through fresh corpses in front of an audience, and they would twitch. And this reminds me a bit of like what somebody like Ray Kurzweil would be doing today, somebody trying to get attention by seeming to threaten the very nature of human existence. And I say, is Ray here? No, I like Ray, but I mean, that is what he does. So at any rate, so if Mary Shelley set the tone, what happened with H.G. Wells is it became a little bit more gritty and more instrumental and more immediate. So a great example of that is The War of the Worlds, where you have a guy with a time machine who goes into the future and discovers that the human species has split in two. And there's one population that is the beneficiary of the technology, and then the left are left behind. And the interesting insight of Wells is that both of them are degraded. neither side is happy. Both of them become absurd and alienated, if we can use Marx's term. And I think he was quite right about that. Quite an important book. That template for science fiction, which also you see in Frankenstein, that template that if advancement means that you lose something of what it is to be human, nothing is really gained. That template is the universal template of science fiction. Some that apply very specifically to labor might include Vonnegut's Player Piano, but more recently in pop culture, The Matrix is a great example, but it comes up again and again. And all of cyberpunk is like that. Okay, now let's go to Marx. Marx was a technology writer first and foremost. I had that insight once when I was driving in Silicon Valley, and KPFA, our lefty station in Berkeley, was broadcasting somebody talking about something about breaking down market barriers and global access to this and that, and labor will do this. And I was thinking, oh my God, it's another one of these stupid Silicon Valley startups that's going to revolutionize the world with whatever their thing is. I can't stand hearing from these stupid little startups anymore. And it actually turned out to be an anniversary reading of Das Kapital. And if you happen to be lucky and you get just the right passage, it does really read like the latest prospectus for some stupid startup. And so Marx was very much keyed into the idea of technology and change. This was entirely the motivation. And Marx suggested an alternative to the sort of Shelley-Wells notion that there's this, as technology gets better, instead of getting what Aristotle wanted, we lose ourselves, that sort of fear that it all goes terribly wrong. So Marx sort of revived Aristotle's hope. This is the way philosophers think, I suppose. And his notion was, no, actually, when the machines are good enough, there'll be some sort of structure that provides for everybody. Everybody should benefit. And the tricky thing about that is that then you have to sort out what is good for people by politics, and politics is sort of always ugly, and so, or always limited. When you read in Marx the place where he comes, he occasionally comes to this thing about like, well, what will it be like after the machines are good and the revolution is done and everything's good? Like, what are we fighting for here? And he describes things like, we'll relax in beautifully manicured lawns, practicing archery and reading the classics. And I'm kind of on board for the lawns and the classics. Archery, maybe not so much. And here we come to precisely the problem that it does require somebody to decide what's good for other people. And to a degree, you can do that because there's some things that are in common. Like to say people need health care is easy. To say they need archery, you've gone over the line. And there you hit exactly where the limit is of the various flavors of neo-Marxism. And so that one, and also just empirically, every time somebody tries to sort out what's good for everybody, it only works if there's a monoculture. And this is a thing I observe again and again, that people who are part of a monoculture are convinced they're part of the most diverse, wonderful thing in the world. Burning Man's a great example. If you go to Burning Man, everybody says, oh, we're this anarchic anything goes, but in fact it's not at all. It's a monoculture that's highly structured and highly ritualistic, and one that I have good things, I'm not criticizing it at all, but it's just true that that's what it is. And anyone who's tried to live in a group household or something knows what happens when people who aren't really compatible live together. And so that led people on the Marxist path to try to make people more similar, and that's what Maoism is about and all of that. And so I don't think that that's the future either. There's another stream that was very active in the 19th century, which was the I guess it actually been started earlier by Rousseau, but the really great expression of it is in the early 20th century with E.M. Forster's short story, The Machine Stops. Anybody know that one? Anybody not read The Machine Stops? Okay, so you have to immediately, after you've done with your diligent board duties, okay, the next thing you have to do is read this. It's a short story by E.M. Forster, who, did all the novels that turned into Merchant Ivory movies and all that. But he wrote this thing that was sort of an answer to Wells, and it's a kind of Rousseauian form of science fiction, but the amazing thing about it is many, many decades before, it's already over a century old. I think it was 07 or 08 that this thing was written. decades before Turing, decades before computers, he describes the internet as we know it today in just eerie accurate detail. He has everything in there. He has something like Facebook and something like Twitter and something like Skype, and he has the grunge of the companies and incompatibility problems, and he has the social issues and just the way it feels. It's just so strange that it almost seems impossible. It almost seems as though he must have had one of those time machines that H.G. Wells talked about. But anyway, the problem with the problem with the machine stops is that at the end of it, the internet breaks down, which is the machine stopping, and a great many people die, and there's this horrible thing. But then there's some people who sort of crawl out from behind their screens and look up, the sun, and there's this sort of notion that, and this is, I guess, in a sense aligned with Shelley and Wells, but the notion is that you find some sort of back to nature thing, and that you retreat from all of this technological stuff to find truth and goodness. But that is really not a solution either, because as Aristotle showed us, the way back is not a way to the sun, it's a way to slavery. It's just the truth. It might not be what we wish is true, but it is true. So we don't have a choice of rejecting technology. We can be selective about it, but we can't sort of decide that what is technical is not human, is not true, is not beautiful. That's a really hopeless and dismal conclusion. The ending from The Machine Stops appears in a continued Rousseauian thread. I had a problem with it when I was an advisor to a movie called Minority Report about 10 years ago, where Spielberg wanted to stick the same ending on it, and of course did, because it was his movie. So in the fun, we had all these crazy gadgets for all the bad, the dystopian stuff, but then the beautiful ending where everybody's kind of all truth and beauty and love appear, no gadgets in the room. And I was like, oh, let me put a good gadget in the final scene, please. No gadgets. So here we were still trapped by Forster so many years later. Okay, now, so I've outlined sort of three ways to think about the far future of people and machines. One is a whole bunch of people are left behind, everybody's alienated. Two is there's some kind of official body, a communist party or something, that sorts out the benefits of the machines and maintains everybody, and they had better conform and like what they get. Or three, we reject it all and go all Rousseauian and hope for the best. So those are the three. That was the legacy of the first conversation, which lasted through the world wars. And all three of those are crap. I absolutely categorically reject all three. The first alternative, a fourth way, appeared in 1960. And it's strangely not well known, and it's the one I'm trying to revive, and I think it's the one that offers a channel of hope. So in the 1960s, the first technical proposal for the internet was created, and this was by a guy named Ted Nelson. How many people have heard of Ted Nelson? Okay, so Ted's the most unlikely person in the world to have this role. He's still with us. He's in his 70s, I guess. He lives on a houseboat in Sausalito, of course. And he's a sort of Kerouac or hippie-like guy, a vagabond, stream of consciousness, oddball, wrote the first rock opera, has had all kinds of misadventures, child of Hollywood parents, and happened to be interested in computers and information in the very early days. And he, having come from Hollywood parents, naturally thought, well, if you do something with your heart and your mind, if your product is information, you've got to be paid, or else you don't have a society that's made of information. It's as simple as that. If we eventually believe that information will become what the economy is about, if people don't get paid for it, then they'll be left out. I mean, it's so simple. It's just axiomatic. It's so simple that it's easy to miss. But anyway, from the very beginning, the very first proposal, this wasn't in response. This was actually the first idea of the internet ever, period, was all about how the purpose of the internet was that people who would make their way out of what they did with their hearts and minds would get paid. And so that you could have a middle class, you could have a civilization as machines got really good. That was the original function of the thing. There had been some proposals for things like computers with remote access to information, like Vannevar Bush's famous essay from, there's a thing called As We May Think that involved microfiche and all kinds of pre-digital technologies where he imagined what a computer would be like. But as far as an actual sending bits around thing, it was invented for this purpose. It was invented to overcome the 19th century. It's just that the guy who invented it was such an unlikely, he was like the very least, with the exception of me maybe, he was the most inappropriate human to come along to talk about this stuff. Like, it should have been somebody like a Walt Disney, or it should have been somebody, you know, somebody who was an industrialist or a great statesman, or an Einstein, somebody who is, you know, a great recognized scientist. It should have been somebody like that, but instead it was a beatnik hippie guy. And so the thing is, it was the only idea on the table for a while, so it was the official standing idea for quite some time. And I'll give you an outline of how that first idea of the internet worked, just to give you a picture. The first thing is that there's only one online store. Everybody is a first-class citizen. So right now, for instance, when you buy something from Amazon or Apple or Barnes & Noble or whatever it is, you're not a first-class participant in the same way that you were when you used to buy a real book or a real record. And what I mean by that is if you buy a book, you gain all the benefits of ownership, which means if you have a rare edition, its value might actually go up, and you might be able to resell it. There's no such thing as a purchase that isn't potentially an investment in the real world where you're a first-class participant in the economy. But when you're a peon within a company store environment, you're not a first-class citizen, so you can't resell, you can't benefit from changes to the value of what you've bought. You're purely a sort of a contract recipient consumer in a more subservient role than anyone's experienced since the days of company stores and the railroads or something, which were outlawed. So there was going to be only one store. It's a government function. So if you're a Tea Party type, run screaming now, because it might get a little worse in a second for you. And so there's a single, just like there's a single currency, there's a single point of exchange. Everybody's a first-class citizen. Now, another interesting thing is there's universal micropayments, and so anybody can send money to anybody in arbitrarily small amounts. That's a very crucial. Being able to send tiny increments of money is quite an interesting thing, and can solve some economic problems. Whether it should be able to go to arbitrary precision is a very interesting thing, and the answer to that is probably no, but that's a technical point. Another very interesting issue, and probably the single most important point, is that it's designed to not lose provenance of information. And this is something that's provenance, where information came from, who put it there. Now, this is something of absolutely crucial import that I can't overstate enough. So in the original idea, there was no copy function. There's no cut, copy, paste. And that might sound strange to you, but think about it. It's on a network, so you don't need a copy. The original's there. It's on a network. So just to give you a sense of how this works, you do have mirrors. So to give you a feeling for what I mean by that is think about the Apple Store or the Amazon Store. If you download something, of course there's going to be mirror images as an engineering matter, because you don't want somebody located in Australia to have to reach the server in Finland or something. That would be silly. But from a logical point of view, from a consequential point of view, there's only one copy of each Apple app. And when you sort of subscribe to it, and you do download a copy in a sense, but in a sense you don't, because you can't move it around independently. They're all essentially logically one thing. And so it's a very simple idea, but the original idea was that all information would be like that. Now, the reason provenance is absolutely crucial is because provenance is based on a metaphysical belief that information only has meaning because of people's use of it. Now, this gets a little confusing. What happened is in later Silicon Valley culture, we started to use information to mean two totally different things. So there's one physics idea of information, which was defined by a guy named Claude Shannon, which relates to the idea of entropy and as a physical property, and that's something real. We can talk about that. But everyday information, like the bits on a disk, is something entirely different. The particular arrangement of the bits on this disk only have meaning in a cultural context. Otherwise, they don't, period. If you gave the disk to an alien, they really would not have the context to decode the bits. And so if you put a computer down here, all of those patterns on the screen, or you put an iPad or whatever gadget works as a thought experiment gadget at the moment, it's like a lava lamp. It's making patterns, it's radiating heat. It's only a computer when there's a person with a culture shared with the person who put the bits in the first place. So the thing is, there's always a person there. And as long as you maintain the memory of who put the bits there, you make several things possible. One, you maintain the potential that they can be compensated. Two, there's somebody to take responsibility, so we don't pretend the internet's just happening to us. We don't enter into this machine-centric fantasy of loss of control, which is very, very popular now. Three, you can find out what's there instead of treating the internet as this wild that you have to explore as if it was an alien artifact, which is what we do now because we lost provenance. So in Ted's idea, there could be chains of provenance. So for instance, if somebody wants to quote a sample of somebody else's sound in some hip-hop production or something, instead of just copying it and losing the provenance, they actively point back to it. And if they got some money, a fraction of it would actually flow back to the original. And so there'd be these chains of provenance that would be calculated automatically. And it's quite a startling idea, and it's vastly more elegant than what we have now. Now, this idea of losing provenance came about for stupid reasons. It primarily happened in the 70s and 80s, and it primarily happened because all the engineers of the actual internet as it was implemented were either running away from the draft or the pot police. And so what you had is, this is something one isn't supposed to talk about, but at one of the original labs where internet servers were located, which was in a dilapidated building at Stanford that no longer exists, up in the hills just above campus, there used to be pot plants being warmed by the heat from the computers. And so you have this counterculture, and you still had, at the beginning of the phase, you still had people worried about the draft. Of course, that went away. And so there was this idea, this fantasy grew up that all of us are going to use information systems to hide from the man. And what freedom was about, what intelligence was about, what self-determination was hiding from the government. And so there was this fantasy that we're all sort of like Che in the jungle, except with computers. And so everything turned into anonymity and losing provenance and not really being sure who somebody was when they posted. And it really came out of this thing. And now, for the counterparts of these people who were in the military, when the military was the other great source of the internet at that time, of course, they also had exactly the same thing, and it was about even stupider issues. At that time, from in the 70s and going into the 80s, there was also a right-wing fantasy about avoiding the police, and a lot of it was being able to speed on the highway because people would use CB radios and handles, and they didn't want to get caught. So the same sort of fantasy that the government's the problem and you want to hide from it and make everything anonymous and lose provenance on the internet also took hold in sort of what we now call red state America. And I distinctly remember these things happening, and I was born in 1960, so in the late 70s I was a teenager, and in the very early 80s I became very actively engaged in the politics of all of this. And even back then, we really foresaw a great deal of the end game that we've entered into now. And I distinctly remember being with Ted Nelson at one of these sort of underground computer gatherings, which really weren't so underground, on the Stanford campus or something like that. And and talking about the importance of provenance, how it would allow middle class to exist in an information economy, all these same issues. And there would be like these anarchists or Maoists who would just scream, no, 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 this is just going to give the man information about people. No, no, no. They were very much the moral predecessors of today's like open source Linux, whatever type people. And it just turned into this shouting match, which was also foresaw the way a lot of the internet is these days. Of just, I just remember like some of the early like Usenix people and Ted just screaming "fuck you" at each other, and it's like, so the whole thing just broke. But it was really over the sense of what it means to have a counterculture, and whether the counterculture is really committed to the middle class or not. We ended up, for that reason, with a network architecture that's specifically designed to lose provenance. So almost all of the trendiest things that have happened since that time have been all about the magic of losing provenance and being able to pretend that something is happening without human volition on the internet as if it were alive on its own. Great examples of that are the Wikipedia. Oh, look at the thing grow as if without human hands, and Google is a really interesting thing because Google's great, and certainly some kind of search function would be needed in any architecture, but needing to index the whole damn internet in order to search for it is only needed because you lost provenance. I mean, it's really like the whole. It's a whole solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed. And in fact, you see Google has a perverse motivation to keep on funding all sorts of open source things and whatnot, because the more chaotic and forgetful the internet is, the more power there is in searching through the whole damn thing to try to rationalize it again. So in my view, the whole thing is sort of this giant confusion scam or something of creating this huge problem for no reason and then creating a fortune undoing it to some degree. And I should say that you probably know this, but just to be clear, I'm not saying anything behind the backs of anybody. The founders of Google are friends of mine. I've sold a company to Google. I consider myself, I was just at Google yesterday. I'm part of this. I'm one of them. I say this to my friends. I still have my meal card there because if you have technical chops, they can't throw you out of Silicon Valley. So this is not like me as a rebel bad-mouthing people that I'm not associated with. I see these people all the time. I'm trying to change their minds. And I think they're smart and of goodwill, and I think I'm making a little bit of progress. But anyway, that's just so you have that context. So the provenance was lost through a variety of mechanisms. Part of it was the introduction of cut, copy, paste. That's an interesting tale in itself. If you go back to the 70s, I remember the first time when I was a teenager, I met a guy named Alan Kay, who was running a lab in Palo Alto called Xerox PARC. And they pretty much invented the modern experience of consumer computing. The sort of icons and the whole thing that we still see today came out of that little lab. And at the time, they were sponsored by this large company, Xerox, that famously was never able to make heads or tails of it and didn't benefit from having funded the research. That's one of the great all-time stories of failing to benefit from research, and there are many books about it. There's one called Fumbling the Future. But anyway, I remember being they used to have what at that time was this very advanced avant-garde thing, which would be beanbag chairs, and you all sit around in an informal meeting, and it felt very revolutionary and amazingly 60s-like at the time. So I was at one of these things with the beanbag chairs at Xerox PARC, and I remember somebody saying to Alan, why is there a copy function? It's stupid. We're going to network these things. We don't need copies. And it was like, are you kidding? Xerox is funding this. We can't go to Xerox and say, not only is this going to change everything, not only were there the digital versions of documents, but, oh, by the way, the very concept of the copy and the abstract, which your whole company is based on, is now obsolete and completely unneeded. Like that would just, like it was already such a hopeless case that this lab was funded. To go that step would have just been beyond, conception. So that's part of why there's copying. Another thing happened, which was the birth of, so just before the web protocol started, HTML and browsers and all that, we were in the environment I was describing, the sort of post-60s countercultural movement in which provenance was being lost as a sort of a Che fantasy. And the original, I remember like when Tim Berners-Lee made HTML, he brought it around to various conferences and everybody said, but wait, this breaks provenance. You don't have two-way links anymore. And he was like, well, yeah, it's simple and it seems to be what people want. And that's the thing that took off, and the usual way that that's interpreted in the computer science community is it would have been nice to do real two-way links, as Ted Nelson had proposed, but one way was good enough. Losing provenance was fine. Good enough. The problem is it's only good enough for some like abstract conception of a super smart machine taking over the earth and abandoning people. If what you care about is humans being able to make their living from their hearts and minds in the future, the severing of provenance is a disaster. And so what's happened since we went down that path is so perverse that it's almost like the most weird, dark, stupid thing that we used to talk about as a possible outcome is what's actually happened, and it just blows my mind. So what's happened is the advertising business model, which is really quite a misnomer. Now, Sergey Brin came up with this, and he's a great guy. I really like Sergey. He's a guy of tremendous goodwill, a person of tremendous decency, and a person who, once again, I hope to persuade over time. part of my reason for writing the book is honestly, the more popular legitimacy the ideas get, the harder it is for my friends in Silicon Valley to say, oh, that's just Jaron. You know, like at some point I'm trying to build up enough force to really persuade my buddies there. But at any rate, Sergey claims to have come up with this on a date where some ambitious Stanford woman demanded to know the business plan for search. And that's entirely believable to me. That would be very Stanford-like to happen. But at any rate, the thing about it is it's not really advertising. Like, in my view, I very much have a love-hate relationship with advertising. I can illustrate that very clearly with an anecdote. I was once in a cab in New York, and this horrible cloying jingle came on for a furniture chain. And I told the driver, can you please turn that radio down? And it was New York, and the cab driver says, hey, it's my cab. You want to turn down the radio? You get your own cab. You know, this sort of very typical thing. And then a moment later, wait, my buddy and I made that jingle. That's me. I played that flute line. You know, like all of a sudden I hit, oh my God, I'm annoying myself. And I think essentially that is, in a capsule, that's the nature of advertising. It's something that we need for civilization. We need to romanticize our production. We need to romanticize change. We need to romanticize modernity, and advertising does that. And at the same time, all the bad things one can say about it are absolutely true. It is manipulative, it is cloying, it is often degrading, and yet we do it to ourselves, and we benefit from it. And that whole weird mixed bag is all there, it's all valid. But that, whatever advertising is, it's not what Google does. Google makes almost all of its money with, there's only a token amount that exceeds the bounds of these little tiny links, which are just like, click on this to go there. And they've recently tried to make more and more of them have a little bit of graphical content, but the truth is it's not changing the business dynamic, and it's probably ancillary and unimportant. So what they're really selling is paid links. And so when you start to look at what the business really is, it's not advertising in the cloying, romantic, annoying sense. Instead, it's paid links. It's paying to change the topology of how people are connected together. And once you see that, you realize the absurdity of losing provenance, because what it does is it creates a market for artificial provenance. What it does is it creates this huge hole that needs to be filled, because unconnected information isn't information at all. And so then it creates a corrupted form of context. Now, I'm starting to speak a little more abstractly, and what I just want to ask you is, if I say something that seems a little overly broad and unclear, ask me to reframe it, because my purpose here is to make sense. And I speak to a very wide range of audiences, and there's nothing at all to be embarrassed about. It's my job to be clear, so tell me if any of that didn't follow. So now what we have is this new concept, and I'm trying to come up with a little word for this for my next book, but I'm currently calling them master servers. Master servers. So a server is a computer over the net that you communicate with, and certain ones of them become incredibly important, and I'm calling those the master servers. So Google has one, Facebook has one. My research these days is paid for by the one owned by Microsoft, and so forth. Like I say, I'm absolutely part of this. I'm not speaking as an outsider. I'm speaking as a dissident insider. And so master servers act essentially as private spy agencies, except they're more efficient than any spy agency in history. They're sort of super ultra spy agencies, and people use them voluntarily. And this is the thing that just absolutely blows my mind. I think perhaps the political benefits of tools like Twitter and Facebook are overstated, but let's just suppose that we accept the most optimistic assessment of the role that Twitter and Facebook played in the Arab Spring, or in Occupy Wall Street, or for that matter in the Tea Party, depending on what you think is a good thing for the world. Let's say we accept all that. It's still the case that there's not even the first thought that Twitter would help create jobs for Egyptians. There's not even the first thought that using Twitter is going to help anybody at Occupy Wall Street find a job. We've completely given up the idea that technology is how we'll find sustenance or dignity. And that was never true before. what's absolutely astonishing is there's been this very recent shift in how much we expect from technology in order to exclude security, dignity, sustenance. We've excluded that stuff, and nobody's even commented upon it. And if this is strikingly different from in earlier waves of technological change. Despite the Luddites being put out of work, their descendants had gradually more dignified, safer, and more cerebral work until the turn of the century and the advent of the so-called advertising model. All the way up through then, whenever jobs were made obsolete by advancing technology, ones that were more cerebral or more about the heart and the head would come to replace them. And the reason for this is that technology is not freestanding. There's no such thing as genuine autonomy. There's always somebody running it. And so all you do is make the job be about whatever that new role is of running the stuff. But as soon as you break provenance and you pretend the technology is freestanding, then all of a sudden those people are out of work. And so what's happened with the internet revolution of late is not that the people aren't needed anymore. It's rather that we've redefined the way that people are needed as being unpaid. And that's a crucial, crucial difference. So in order for, let me give you an example of that. One of the things that, there's so many examples. Everything runs on what's called big data these days, where you make giant databases and then you use statistics to derive predictions and various facilities out of it. And it can be kind of an amazing tool. It can really work. So, for instance, Google and Microsoft are competing to make a better machine translator. So you point your camera phone at this, and it figures out it's a bottle of Aquafina and tells you about the word Aquafina, whatever, all kinds of stuff. All right, so in order for that to happen, there has to have before been an enormous number of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of instances in which some other camera saw this thing and it was correlated with someone doing something, and it's the correlations that are able to derive the answers. It's the giant correlative database that makes everything tick. And that correlative database comes from people inputting data. So it's actually a reflection of humans entering data that makes it work, and yet that's all unpaid. And the fact that it's unpaid is entirely a political or spiritual decision. There's no particular reason why it should be one or the other. It could be paid, and in fact, if it were paid, it would reflect the reality of where contributions come from, and it would point a direction towards an eventual structure in which you could have very advanced technology and still have middle classes. And this is a crucial thing. One of the way back when Ted was first talking about this in the mid-20th century, and when I came on the scene, one of the constant objections was that only a tiny percentage of people have anything to offer. Most people have nothing to offer. They're going to be wards of the state. They're useless. They offer nothing. They're not creative. They're not smart. It's only us tiny elite who are. Everybody else are the sheep that we'll either take care of or not. That was the attitude. But now what we've seen in the actual internet, and we've seen it overwhelmingly confirmed again and again and again for a decade and a half without any possible other interpretation, is that vast numbers of people have contributions that are of value to others. It's simply not true that there's only a tiny elite that has anything to offer. And so we now know for sure that the distribution of value among people working in an information zone out of their hearts and their heads is one that can support a middle class. If that was a question before, it can't possibly be one anymore. So if we had kept provenance, then it would be possible to send micropayments to each person who had input the tiny bit of data that contributed to the correlative database that allowed a Google camera or a Microsoft camera or whatever to interpret what they see or to translate text from one language to another or whatever. And that act of adding would become in itself not a lot of money, admittedly. It might be sort of analogous to donating blood or something for people who are living marginally. But the point is, even that, the principle is crucial, because as long as you have some substantial minority that's doing better than that, then others can work for them. So you can never have an economy in which everybody's above average, obviously. But what you can have is you can have an economy that's shaped like a bell instead of a U, which is what we're heading towards. So it used to be that the way the U was shaped is the people on the top end of the U were the ones who owned the oil fields or were given giant land grants during colonial times or something like that. If you look at the distribution of billionaires, almost the people who own oil fields are still there. There's still some billionaires there, but they're in the decline. And almost everybody who's entered into the top of the U recently owns one of the master servers. There are a lot of different master servers. I've mentioned the Google and Facebook examples, but there are many others. For instance, finance has been taken over by them. So hedge funds, high-frequency trading computers, many other schemes. These things are so similar to Google and Facebook servers that it's like when you visit them, it's the same people. Like it's the same, like people who are roommates at MIT or Caltech, one goes to Google and the other goes to some hedge fund, and they're doing the same work. The atmosphere is the same. The scheme is the same. What you do is you have a computer that has enough visibility on events over the internet that it can gain an advantage and just pull money out of it, use the information advantage almost without bounds. There's a great deal to explain about how master servers work, and it's sort of eerie to me that this isn't studied more. And in fact, I've had the experience of speaking to my colleagues at Silicon Valley about it, and they'll say, "Oh my God, that is what we do." You know, like it's just we haven't really thought about it this way enough. But let me give you an example of how master servers accumulate power and wealth. Recently, Eric Schmidt, who's another guy who's great, you know, I've known him forever too, but he was testifying in D.C. to try to sort of blunt the potential for antitrust action against Google. And one of the things he said is, hey, Google customers like you, when you do a search, you're free to leave. We don't have some sort of hold on you. Go use Bing, that's fine. And it's just amazing to me that nobody stopped and said, wait a second, those people aren't customers. Those are the product. When you use Facebook or Google, you are not a customer. You are the product. You are being packaged by them. When CalArts students meticulously maintain their Facebook pages or their Twitter, their tweet streams or whatever, all that stuff is not the real them from a commercial point of view. The real them is the secret dossier they never get to see, which is the one sold to third parties who are the so-called advertisers but are really just paying to influence the topology. Yeah, well, the data that's monetized is the consequential data. The other stuff is fluff. I mean, with some exceptions. Look, there are some Horatio Alger sorts of stories where somebody does well because they had a successful YouTube video, but the numbers are so small as to really be inconsequential. So what happens is, for real customers, for the people who pay money, what Google will tell you when you're signing up for AdSense, and maybe I should use Bing in order to not be biased. So what Bing will tell you when you're signing up to use Bing link services is they'll say, in the past, in the advertising business, you put in all this money, and it's very statistical from your point of view. You don't know what ad reached what person. It's this very blunt instrument. But here, because we can follow the clicks, we can be very precise, and we can tell you this is the benefit. And there's truth to that. And but the thing that they don't tell you, and this is really the crucial mechanism that makes master servers become more and more powerful over time, is that the negative value, the downside of switching away from being signed up for one of these master servers has more scary consequences than in the past. And to try to give you a sense of that, let's consider a pre-internet advertiser who's saying, look, I currently am paying for a billboard on the freeway, and I'm advertising my furniture chain store or whatever. And I'm thinking maybe I want to shift some money to radio, so I'm gonna let that billboard go. So I don't know who's going to get that billboard. It might be a competitor in the furniture business, or it might be a gas station, or it might be the lottery, or it might be anything, I don't know. So I'm trading off a known, which is how much I'm spending on the billboard, versus an unknown, which is who else will get the billboard instead. But the moment you let go of a position on one of these master servers, whether you're an investor in a hedge fund or you're paying for a keyword association in Google or something, you know for certainty that your closest rival will get it instead, because it's all set up on an auction basis. So what happens is you get locked in, because if you lose your position, you know with absolute certainty that your rival will be there. And that's the true lock-in mechanism, and that's why these things become so sticky, as we say in Silicon Valley. And that's the thing you're not, I've just told you the thing we're not supposed to say. I've just broken the deepest taboo. But what the hell? So So these things, there are many other examples. The great commercial pioneer of master servers was probably Walmart, actually. Walmart used a server that gathered data from all over, from manufacturers and transportation and from the retail stores, to optimize their whole operation to the point where they had all of their vendors locked in exactly the mechanism that I described, where if you don't sell us the sandals at this lower cost, you know for sure that your next greatest rival will. So you become locked in, and that's always the mechanism. And the problem with doing it that way, if you look at it was interesting, in the late 90s, if you looked at the richest Americans, they were all either Microsoft or Walmart. So it's all about the servers. And the thing about Walmart is that the system works so well that it actually makes the context in which wealth even exists absurd after a while. Like, there's no break on it. So what happened with Walmart is they put so many, there's this question of, well, yeah, you're spending less, but you're also losing your job. So can you save enough money to make up for not being employed? And the answer is no. Like, at a certain point, losing employment prospects will outrun the potential for savings. And it's very much the same thing with Google. Getting free services will be outrun by not having a job. And so this always drives me nuts with kids who are saying, oh, isn't it great I have all these free Google services, and yeah, I'm not getting paid for my music, but I get these free services. And I'm like, well, do you want to have kids someday? Do you want to be able to live on your own? I mean, like, you can't play that game of using savings to outrun income. It's a hopeless game, but at any rate, that's the position you get into when you're a peasant of the master server. And so the problem is that mankind has often survived stupid systems and unfairness and everything, so I'm not demanding a perfect world, but the master servers accumulate so much wealth so intensely that they actually destroy their own environment. So what's been happening with Walmart is it's finally impoverished its own customers enough that it's starting to hit limits. And that's exactly what happened with the mortgage industry and with finance in general. And I think it's approximately happening in a slower way with social media and the world of intellectual commerce, of anything, like I say, related to the heart and mind. Now, all of that's bad enough, but the thing we have to understand is that in the next decades, we're going to face what I call mass unemployment events, or similar to mass extinction events. I'll give you a few examples of those, and these are big and complex enough events that it becomes difficult to predict with certainty in what year they'll hit and exactly what the nature of it, but I think we can already tell a little bit. One is self-driving vehicles. So it's already been a few years that there have been well-demonstrated self-driving vehicles. There's an overwhelmingly strong case for the desirability of self-driving vehicles. From a commercial point of view, a self-driving truck is cheaper than a truck with a driver, but it also won't kill people as much. Self-driving vehicles can't really be as bad as we are at driving, and many more of us are killed in car accidents, including my own mother, than are killed by almost anything else. I mean, it's this overwhelming carnage in modernity, so it simply must stop. Some sort of recreational driving is one thing, but we can't depend on having people behind wheels anymore. It's just ridiculous once that can be fixed. So as a technologist, I really want to see self-driving vehicles, and I've worked on that. But, I mean, if you look at what the middle classes do to survive, a whole lot of the middle class is behind a wheel. Truckers, taxi drivers, and so forth, delivery guys and gals. I mean, post office, parcel. I mean, and that all will go away. Now the question is when. And what tends to happen with these things is it's just inconceivable that we could have self-driving vehicles, and it's inconceivable until all of a sudden there's one year where just things happen. And a trigger event, I'm giving this a window of between 10 and 20 years from now, but it could easily be sooner or later than that. 5 years is at least possible. 30 years is possible too. 40, I would really doubt. I mean, it's a thing for this century. And the kind of driving event would be people starting to sue operators of vehicles for not having had a machine. Or there might be a gradual thing where there's more and more machine backup for collision avoidance. Just to give you some other ideas of why we want this, right now, if there's a lane merger on a freeway, every car that's backed up has to wait for every little ego battle for the cars to merge at the merge point. In LA, this is particularly acute. if the cars are driving themselves, they coordinate, and the hypothetical carrying capacity of the freeways is much, much greater than we enjoy with human drivers. So essentially we can get rid of a lot of traffic jams and get around much faster. The other thing is they can manage the air together to enjoy greater fuel efficiency, and there's just so many other things. There are just enormous efficiencies to be had from it. So it'll happen. What happens to all those people? Another one is automated manufacture. So there's already a hobbyist community of 3D printers. I imagine you have a sculpture department here with a 3D printer or two. And if you don't, you should. And that's a technology that just prints out objects from a file. There's just little scanning devices that leave materials, and you end up with an object, sometimes working objects, objects with gears, objects with chips even at this point. That technology can undermine the whole way we make things. Instead of having a factory somewhere and then having the truck deliver a manufactured good, you just download the file from Object Napster or whatever provenance-losing impoverishment agent you choose, and then the thing is printed out. Once again, there are overwhelming reasons to do that, and the most overwhelming one is that if manufacturing is automated and provenance is kept instead of lost, then we'll have detailed records on exactly how everything was made and what's in it, so that we can have disassembling machines to recycle it with high efficiency. And I don't know of any other path to sustainability. It's the only game in town if you want long-term sustainability of advanced manufactured goods. So the case for doing it is absolutely overwhelming. Yeah?
May I suggest that we break for lunch, go up to the lunchroom, and continue with us over lunch?
Oh, I'm sorry. Have I been going on too long? I just realized that I actually don't have a clock or anything, so I mean, actually, I can sort of end. I think I sort of covered it. Oh, yeah. Well, see, the problem is the moment you get a master server, somebody from Silicon Valley will trick you out of it. We're very good at that game. We're super good at it. Okay. Yeah, the path forward. I think there is, yeah. I think there's a way to fix it. Okay. Okay, cool. Well, look, thanks for listening to all that. And,